For 40 years, the story of African economic power had only two characters: Nigeria and South Africa, oil and gold. Two giants who grew so large on extraction that they convinced themselves and the entire world that the continent rotated around their axis. They were wrong. While the old guard spent the last decade trapped in the arithmetic of depletion, currency collapses, stalled refineries, capital fleeing faster than it arrives, two nations in the East have been playing a different game entirely. They are not asking for permission to join the global economy. They are building their own on-ramp. And in 2026, the numbers have stopped whispering. They are shouting. If you believe that African wealth should be refined, manufactured and traded on African terms, not extracted and shipped, tap the like button now. This is the story of how two nations are rewriting the economic map of the continent, and why the old giants are suddenly looking over their shoulders. Let us begin with arithmetic. It is unforgiving. It is also undeniable. East Africa is now the fastest growing region on the African continent, 5.8%. Not because of aid, not because of debt forgiveness, because of infrastructure, because of integration, because Ethiopia decided to skip the agrarian century and leap directly into manufacturing, because Kenya decided that the future of finance does not require a bank branch. Now compare: West Africa, 4.4%, North Africa, 4.1%, Southern Africa, dragging at 2.0%. The gap is not marginal, it is structural, it is widening by the month, and it is not an accident of geography. Kenya's GDP has reached approximately $135 billion, the largest economy in the East African community. Ethiopia follows at $117 billion, but the growth rate is the real story. Ethiopia is expanding at 7.2%, the highest in the region, the highest among non-oil African economies. While Nigeria's naira has lost half its value against the dollar in 2 years, the Kenyan shilling has stabilized. While South Africa's grid flickers under load shedding, Ethiopia's dams are generating surplus electricity and selling it across borders. This is not charity. This is execution. And execution is its own currency. To understand Kenya, you must first understand what Lagos got wrong. For years, Lagos was the undisputed capital of African tech, the venture capital darling, the hustle capital. Investors flew in, wrote checks, and flew out, convinced they had found the next Bangalore. But Lagos suffered from a condition no amount of startup funding could cure: unreliable power, crumbling roads, a city so congested that the commute itself became a full-time occupation. Investors poured money into Nigerian fintech, watched their portfolio companies scale, and then watched them suffocate under the weight of physical infrastructure that had not been upgraded since the 1980s. Nairobi took a different path. It did not wait for the state to build the digital economy. It built the digital economy and forced the state to catch up. M-Pesa was not a government initiative. It was a private sector invention that became so indispensable that the central bank had no choice but to recognize it. Safaricom did not ask permission to connect 20 million Kenyans to mobile money. It simply did it. And the system adjusted. Today, nearly every layer of Kenya's economy is integrated into the cloud: agriculture, banking, retail, logistics. The result is not merely efficiency, it is resilience. When global supply chains fragment, when tariffs rise, when the old rules of trade collapse under protectionism, Kenya's economy does not freeze, it pivots. Because digital infrastructure does not wait for customs clearance. The world's largest technology firms have noticed. Microsoft and the UAE tech giant G42 are investing over $1 billion in a geothermal-powered data center in Kenya's East Africa cloud region. Google is fulfilling a $1 billion commitment to connectivity. Amazon Web Services is pouring part of its $1.7 billion Africa budget into Kenyan servers. Not because Kenya begged, because Kenya built the platform. And the platform works. In 2024 alone, Kenyan startups raised $638 million, 29% of the entire continent's venture capital, 88% of East Africa's share. And here is the detail that should terrify the old guard. The funding is shifting away from fintech, clean tech, green manufacturing, Logistics software. The ecosystem is diversifying because the ecosystem is maturing. Kenya is no longer selling the promise of future growth. It is selling actual, billable, exportable services. Now look north. Ethiopia is not following the Kenyan model. It is following a different playbook entirely, one written not in Silicon Valley, but in Shenzhen. The state does not wait for the private sector. The state builds the stage. The private sector performs on it. This is the Beijing consensus, translated into Amharic. Massive infrastructure. Industrial parks constructed before the factories arrive. Power generation that outpaces demand so that when investors finally land, the grid does not flicker. For years, critics called this approach reckless. They pointed to debt ratios, to inflation, to the gap between ambition and execution. They were not wrong about the risks, but they were wrong about the trajectory. In January 2026, the IMF completed its fourth review of Ethiopia's extended credit facility program and approved an immediate disbursement of $261 million. Total support now exceeds $2.18 billion. The fund's assessment was not grudging, it was declarative. Ethiopia is delivering better than anticipated macroeconomic outcomes. Growth is strong, exports are rising, revenue mobilization is improving, reserves are accumulating, inflation is declining. Mered Fikire Yohannes, who tracks Ethiopia's reforms from inside the system, puts it plainly. From a macro perspective, the reform is moving in the right direction. Export numbers are up. Imports are flowing better. Forex inflows look stronger. The government has stopped printing money. Inflation is coming down. He also notes that households are still struggling, that credit remains tight, that the gap between official and parallel exchange rates creates uncertainty. But he does not say the project is failing. He says the transition is painful. There is a difference. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance, Dam, Africa's new energy artery. For decades, Africa's hydropower story revolved around a single symbol, Egypt's Aswan High Dam. It represented control over energy, water, and regional influence. That chapter is closing. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is now fully operational, $5 billion, 6,000 megawatts, the largest hydroelectric project on the continent. This is no longer just a national project. It is a continental one. Ethiopia is exporting power to Sudan, to Djibouti, to Kenya. It is negotiating agreements with South Sudan, Tanzania, Rwanda. The dam is not merely generating electricity. It is generating leverage. Clean, renewable, tradable leverage. The battery powering the next phase of East Africa's rise is not a metaphor. It is concrete, steel, and water. And it sits in the Ethiopian highlands. Earth movers are reshaping the terrain for the Bishoftu International Airport, $12.5 billion, designed to handle 110 million passengers annually. Not Africa's largest airport, one of the largest airports on the planet. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has called it the largest aviation infrastructure project in Africa's history. For once, the rhetoric matches the reality. Dubai International handles just over 90 million passengers. Istanbul Airport operates in the same range. Ethiopia, a nation of 120 million people with a per capita income still measured in the hundreds of dollars, is building an aviation hub that surpasses both. The arithmetic appears insane, until you understand the logic. Ethiopian Airlines is already Africa's most profitable carrier. It does not need to beg for transit traffic from Europe. It carries Africans between African cities, Lagos to Nairobi, Johannesburg to Addis, Accra to Dar es Salaam. Bishoftu is not a bet on tourism. It is a bet on integration, on the African continental free trade area, on the proposition that Africans will trade more with each other than with distant continents, and that when they do, they will fly through Ethiopia. Kenya is not standing still. President Ruto has announced that 2026 will be a watershed year for Kenyan infrastructure. A modernized Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, standard gauge railway extensions, new highways designed to integrate ports, rails and runways into a single logistics corridor. After the collapse of the Adani deal, Nairobi signaled it is seeking partners such as Qatar for an upgrade exceeding $1.5 billion. The message is clear. We are not guessing. We are not drifting. We have set our targets. We have begun the journey. Kenya is not standing still. President Ruto has announced that 2026 will be a watershed year for Kenyan infrastructure. A modernized Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. Standard gauge railway extensions. New highways designed to integrate ports, rails and runways into a single logistics corridor. After the collapse of the Adani deal, Nairobi signaled it is seeking partners, such as Qatar, for an upgrade exceeding $1.5 billion. The message is clear. We are not guessing. We are not drifting. We have set our targets. We have begun the journey. The centerpiece of this vision is the Lapsset corridor, $20 billion, designed to interconnect Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Sudan. A major trade and logistics artery stretching from the Indian Ocean to the heart of the continent. Its goal is not merely to move goods, it is to reorient the region's economic geography, to connect landlocked nations to the sea via the new port at Lamu, to reduce transportation costs, to create an alternative to the congested colonial-era corridors that still funnel East African trade through Mombasa and Dar es Salaam. This is not infrastructure as convenience. This is infrastructure as declaration. The old routes were designed for extraction. The new routes are designed for integration. Now watch how the two systems connect. This is the most fascinating aspect of East Africa's rise. It is not a competition between Kenya and Ethiopia. It is a symbiosis. Ethiopia provides the cheap electricity that Kenya's data centers consume. Kenya provides the digital architecture that Ethiopia's manufacturers use to reach global customers. Safaricom has expanded into Ethiopia, linking telecommunications and financial markets across the frontier. Ethiopian power traders have signed agreements to supply Kenyan households and industries. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam now feeds into the Eastern Africa power pool, stabilizing grids from Addis to Nairobi. This is not trade, it is fusion. Two distinct development models, one state-led and one private sector-driven, operating in complementary orbit. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa has documented the results. Total trade within the East African community exceeded $11 billion in 2024, a 22% increase from 2023. Intra-African trade grew by 8.5%, far outpacing the 0.4% growth recorded in exports to markets outside the continent. Ethiopia's exports to the United States rose by 95%, Kenya's by 22%. This is not charity, this is trade diversion, and it is permanent. In February 2026, on the sidelines of the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, Kenya launched Biashara Link and Deal House, two interconnected digital platforms designed to transform African embassies from ceremonial relics into transaction-enabling hubs. The arithmetic behind this initiative is staggering. African diplomatic missions receive approximately 3,500 trade inquiries every month. Currently, fewer than 1% translate into closed deals. The new platforms aim to change that. They are not policy frameworks. They are execution engines. They recognize that the problem with African trade is not a shortage of buyers or sellers. It is a shortage of trust, verification, and payment infrastructure that operates across borders. Kenya is not waiting for the AfCFTA Secretariat to solve this problem. It is solving it. Here is what the old giants still do not understand. Nigeria possesses a population of 220 million people. It possesses the largest natural gas reserves in Africa. It possesses a diaspora that remits billions annually. Yet its economy grows at barely half the rate of Ethiopia's. Its currency has lost more than half its value against the dollar in 2 years. Its oil refineries, after decades of privatization, promises, and public investment, still cannot process the crude extracted from its own soil. South Africa, once the continent's undisputed industrial powerhouse, now struggles to keep its lights on. Load shedding has become a permanent feature of economic life. The manufacturing sector that once supplied mining equipment to the entire continent now competes with Chinese imports that are cheaper, better financed, and delivered faster. The narrative of South African exceptionalism, always dependent on the exclusion of the black majority from economic citizenship, has exhausted itself. The old model, extract, export, endure, is not merely failing. It is being rendered obsolete by nations that refuse to accept it as destiny. This is not a victory lap. East Africa is not immune to the diseases that afflict the rest of the continent. Corruption remains endemic. Kenya's digital momentum is powerful, but it has not eliminated the bribery that bleeds billions from procurement contracts. Ethiopia's state-led model concentrates immense power in hands that have not always proven accountable. Debt servicing consumes an unsustainable share of public revenue. The World Bank warns that 40% of African countries remain at high risk of over-indebtedness. Ethiopia's borrowing financed the dam and the railways, but the repayment schedule does not care about good intentions. The AfCFTA, despite its promise, advances at the pace of its most reluctant signatories. Non-tariff barriers remain entrenched. Customs bureaucracies still extract rent at border posts. The dream of a continent without internal trade barriers remains aspirational. But here is the difference. In East Africa, the argument is no longer about whether the state should intervene in the economy. It is about how effectively the state intervenes. Ethiopia's model is not the only path. Kenya's model is not the only path. The coexistence of two competing development strategies, both achieving measurable results, is itself the victory. For decades, African economic policy was dictated by external creditors who demanded the same medicine for every patient: privatize, liberalize, deregulate. The results are visible across the continent: hollowed-out industries, captured regulators, infrastructure that collapsed faster than consultants could write reports on its collapse. East Africa stopped listening. Ethiopia built a dam. Kenya built a data center. Neither asked for permission. Neither waited for the World Bank to certify their readiness. They simply began. And now the numbers have caught up to the ambition. This is the new African economic geography. Not bipolar, with Nigeria and South Africa as the only poles. Polycentric, multiple nodes of accumulation, innovation, and power. Lagos remains essential. Johannesburg remains consequential. But they are no longer inevitable. Capital now flows to where the grid is stable, where the ports are efficient, where the policy environment does not change with every election cycle, where a startup can incorporate in a morning and process its first cross-border payment by afternoon. That is not charity. That is arithmetic. The invisible hand of the market is indifferent to sentiment. It does not reward historical grievance or colonial trauma. It rewards execution. And in 2026, the execution is happening in the East. For 2 generations, the story of African economic power had only 2 names. That story is over. Not because Nigeria and South Africa have collapsed. They have not. Not because East Africa has discovered oil or gold or diamonds. It has not. The story is over because East Africa discovered something more valuable than any mineral. It discovered that the colonial map was not a prison sentence. It was a starting point. The dam is finished. The data center is online. The airport is rising from the Ethiopian highlands. The platforms are processing transactions. The corridors are moving goods. And the old giants, accustomed to commanding the continent's attention, are suddenly realizing that the center of gravity has shifted while they were counting their barrels. This is Voice of Africa. We do not narrate helplessness. We document construction. We trace the new lines being drawn across the African map. Not the borders drawn in Berlin, but the trade corridors, energy grids, and digital networks that Africans are building for themselves. If this story changed how you see the continent's economic future, share it. Send it to someone who still believes that African innovation begins and ends in Lagos or Johannesburg. Send it to someone who needs to understand that the 21st century African economy will not be defined by extraction, but by integration. Subscribe to Voice of Africa. Every week, we bring you the stories that explain how power actually moves on this continent. Not the press releases, the ports, the pipelines, the platforms. And comment below, where are you watching from? Addis Ababa, Nairobi, Lagos, Johannesburg, Accra, Paris, New York, London. Let us see the full map of this community. Let us prove that the diaspora is watching, that the continent is listening, and that the old narrative of African dependency is being retired, line by line, ledger by ledger, road by road, by people who refused to wait for permission. The dam is generating power, the airport is accepting flights, the platforms are closing deals, the center of gravity has shifted. Look east.